We do a lot of camera testing for colour and texture as well before we actually get to build the costumes. We do a lot of testing. And for this one, we started working with a weaver off-site, and these are just a few examples. This was us trying to do it in-house, and knowing that we needed a weaver to try and establish our direction a little. So for Lionel's suit, because we shoot digitally, it's like a square. So the digital cameras hate parallel lines, small weaves and squares. So we're really up against it in trying to develop this. So we finally found, through all this development, a shape that would work, which is like an interlocking star shape really, that reads as a hound's tooth. And then the colours are like a yellow and green that balance each other on the screen. So one of them doesn't stand more forward than the other, and you get a weird kind of like optical illusion going on. So that's where we landed with that. We previously on Coraline way back doing this, where we weren't quite so vigilant with our camera testing. We had to dunk dye a ready-made costume, which is like a horrible idea because of the glues and things involved in it, into brown dye because we hadn't camera tested a small square, and it was boiling horribly and worrying, so we had to keep dipping it in brown until we killed that dimension for the camera so that we could shoot it. So we're very cautious and very aware of that complexity, but as our filming techniques have moved on, cameras have moved on, our techniques have become much more involved. We're much more self-sufficient in the fabrics that we make because of all the reasons I mentioned earlier. It's way better if we can just produce everything ourselves in-house. It's much safer for consistency and supply and demand, so to speak, and replacement. You think these characters have like several years of being built, plus like 2 to 3 years of being shot, and then they have their own tour where they go on promotional tours as well, so they get packed up into boxes and thrown around in planes and have to come out looking gorgeous and stunning. They do, they're very popular. They reach celebrity status, some of these characters. We have to look after them really well. So you can see here from Mr. Link as well, you can see how this feeds back into the Errol O'Kane illustrations of how we went about developing his suit. So it looks like a straight plaid on him here, but it's actually drawn out around the shape and around the contours of his body, because otherwise we'd have so many darts and seams all over the place, you really, really can't do it. So to keep that smooth essence, but to keep this flavour in there, and again, working with the colours and the texture again, this is how we would have to do it. You can see up here, this is a used version of his pants shape here. It's pretty involved. So with all these lines, everything gets moved around incrementally until it fits and works together. And you can see as well, like he stole this suit from the Pacific Northwest bar brawl, which I think you guys have just seen. You can see how pinched it is around his body, and to get that effect we work with digital stitching, so we would draw that out and then program it into a sewing machine and do different versions of it, so it's actually made flat, as you can see up here, but putting the tufts through and working with the shape of the shirt underneath, it looks really taut on his body and like it doesn't fit him. It's pinched up under his arms, it's a little short, it's too short here. All of those things give that kind of comedic effect to him looking kind of clunky in his suit and a little uncomfortable, like it's not his.
Yeah, that was my favorite part.
I like him too. So this colorway came from looking at the Pacific Northwest region's weaving history, so like Pendleton and the White Stag, a company that made workwear. And I don't know if you noticed on the way into Portland, if you saw the Portland, Oregon sign of the White Stag illuminated at the end of the bridge. That's the old workwear sign of the area, and that's now owned by Portland City. It became like a historic landmark in like 1977, and now they pay for all the light bulb replacement and everything. Everyone's really attracted to that sign. It's really quite a landmark. So the colours for Lionel and Adelina, they're based around the involvement of synthetic dyes in 1890 to 1910, where we could use more vivid dyes. So moving away from the Victorian era of kind of dull blues and greys and smoky, sooty colours, and moving into like fuchsia and the turquoise. And this was kind of implemented in their fabrics as a tool to show that they're really forward-thinking and quite sort of fashion-conscious, a little vain. And you can see from Adelina here, she's wearing a swanbill corset, an S-shaped corset. You can see an image up here. It's suitably uncomfortable. But it was a shift forward and more liberating, in fact, than the Victorian crinolines and bustles, which is super cumbersome. And this would have been seen as someone who was more sporty and adventurous, so someone who was going to the gym, or suffragettes on their bicycles would wear these pantsuits. But to the Victorian era, it might have looked a little risque, like they were going out in their underwear or something. You can see her jewellery here. She's wearing a cameo brooch, which is made out of metal, and it would have had like a lock of her husband's hair in a portrait, perhaps. And then her dress, which isn't here, but the dress that you... Did you see the dress on the screen?
Yes.
So it was based on a Victorian mourning dress, but it's fuchsia. So it's a sign that she's kind of moving away from that mourning period, which is quite a lengthy time for the Victorian era, and going towards being more adventurous. And you can see here, this is some of the handwork from her dress. So this is machine embroidered. So we can draw this out and make them flat on machine, and they'd be stitched into mesh, and then we can sew that around her hands. This is a hard hand, but they would be soft. You can see here, up there is a leather glove, and that would be used for close-ups, and the silicone ones we use for wider shots. So we're not using up all our, time and energy on things that are going to be seen more distant. We utilise the techniques that we've got at hand. And this is some of her dress. You can see here, this is like a handmade element of her collar, which is silk threads that are macrameed. And then this is a machine thread that also makes up part of it. So we work out which bits we can use for wear to be more economic with the build, and because we have to build so many duplicates as well. And this is some of the structure that goes into the costumes. So here and here you can see, this is a test for Adelina's pants pattern. So all of these areas are made up of different weight linings, and we patented our own lining for Kubo. And it's made out of metal pigments and fabric glues that are kind of bonded together with different amounts of each one in them to give different weights, different thicknesses. So we can laser cut that here to work inside of our costumes. So we can get that dimpled look to the outside, and it will be in the same place on every single costume, and many people can work building that costume and still get it precise to the millimetre in the build, because there might be maybe 30 that need building, and they need to look the same across the whole film, even though it might be many different puppets that are being edited together.
So it's kind of like a combo of underpinnings and sculpture.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I did a sculpture degree, and I worked in fabrics with abstract figurative shapes, so it kind of rolled into this work pretty naturally. Some of the costumes actually have their own armatures inside them, like they need paddles to move, or here you can see some tests for wiring and meshes, different latex linings, so that they can be posed in position. And then here you can see some of the fur that I mentioned earlier, like how small scale this has become. And this is made with a shrink stitch, so we can put one type of thread on the bottom, a different one on the bottom that shrinks when you wash it, and a stabilizer in the middle. And then we stitch on the top, and then we wash it out and it shrinks up, so we can determine what scale we want these to be and work with that. And repeatable, it's a repeatable technique. So I work with a look dev artist who makes all of these samples for our movies. We work through a process of camera testing for scale, colour, flexibility with the costume department to work out how to move forward until we've got a set of samples that then go to the fabrication department to build into these costumes. So here you can see our Himalayan characters, and this is Gamu, who's a certain type of crazy.
Yeah, I
And
noticed.
we wanted to invest a certain element of authenticity, so I worked with specialists from the Himalayan region
Oh.
to kind of plot the authentic elements that we could put in there that have some resonance for people looking at this and would know those aspects, but also to add a flavour of our own creative license.
Mm-hmm.
So we've recreated like panels from the aprons here with digital stitching and embroidery, and you can see here as well, like just evolving a certain type of weave, like illustrating a type of weave. So it's a little more abstract than the real deal. And just different things like the beads and what type they were and what they represented, and her hair and the colour of the threads that would have been added to her hairstyle, the style of her garments, her belts, and then a little bit of creative licensing, like just having her 1 foot wrapped in bound threads that she's also got on her staff. Many rings, many necklaces instead of the traditional one that would have been worn, and of course the chicken, the chicken on the head. Don't mention the chicken. So
It might
there
be
we
a
have
trend
it.
for the future. Everybody wears chickens on their head.
So here you can see this is also stitching. This is his coat. So underneath here is very much structured to animate. And this is all made of digital stitching, which was modelled on this guy's fur pattern.
Yeah, I was wondering. I saw his fur flowing
it's
in the
just
wind.
part of building up that language across the movie of using the same shapes and line work and qualities. So we traced out this shaping and then transferred it to digital stitching and added in a sort of variant different colour threads to keep it in line with the concept of the movie, but just to give him a slightly different style for a coat. On era for him. He's in his attractive bound gaiters and leather boots. So you can see there's some costume designs up here. So these are all made out of paper. And these the same. So these are the original ones that I work in, and I mentioned before that I've done sculpture, so pattern making is very much part of that. So I know a lot of people illustrate their costume designs in very, very different ways, but that's how I can do it, because I can understand the three-dimensionality of the pattern cutting to do it that way. And I can work with the fabrics that we've built here and photograph them, manipulate them digitally and build them into the scale of the costume as well.